Thank you.
Madam Speaker.
I call the Right Honourable David Carter.
Madam Speaker, it is with a very heavy heart that I will vote for this legislation. National has spent a long time discussing it. We're bereft of information, but after a difficult discussion, National has agreed to vote for this legislation and support it. And being a loyal member of the National Caucus, I have no intention of crossing the floor over this issue, but I'm close. And let me take you through the reasons why I am so concerned. First of all, why the urgency? Why the urgency? Bovis came into this country in July last year. We had a general election in September, a government formed in October. This issue has been on the minister's plate since he became minister, and he's had every opportunity to present this bill to the House. We spent the first almost 6 months of this government passing national legislation. There's nothing complex in this bill around the amendments to the NATE legislation apart from the search powers. This could have been in the House a lot earlier, and it could have gone to a select committee.
That's right.
It could still go to a select committee.
It could.
And yet we had an urgency motion earlier today, voted on by Labor, by New Zealand First, and by the Green Party. And I've been in this House long enough to recall those speeches of the late Rod Donald when he riled against the use of urgency when it wasn't necessary, and he did it with passion. He was principled about the use of urgency, and here we are rushing this legislation through when it doesn't need to be rushed. It could even go to a select committee for a week, and we'd have a chance to look at these issues that concern me and concern fellow National members. I want to pick up on some of the points made by the previous speaker, the New Zealand First member, Mark Patterson. The first point I want to make is he's right. There should be no politics around Mycoplasma bovis. There was initially, as the debate was in this House, and I didn't think that was appropriate. This is an issue we should all be there to support the New Zealand primary sector, and it's not about politics around bovis. But that doesn't stop me criticising the government for not getting this legislation to the House earlier. The second point that really worries me is the search and surveillance powers of NATE officers. And we've been asking of the officials, we've had 2 meetings with the officials, courtesy of the minister. One lasted 25 minutes and the other lasted 35 minutes. That's the extent of briefings. And in the first meeting we had, which lasted the 35 minutes, most of the questions we asked weren't answered because the officials that were presented to us couldn't answer the questions. And yet we hear the contribution from Mark Patterson that it's been through a select committee. It's been through a select committee as the search and surveillance legislation that did go to a select committee in 2012. 2012, when that member, Mark Patterson, was the branch chair of the National Party for the Lawrence branch. That's where he was then. So maybe he can take another call and tell me why New Zealand First voted against the search and surveillance legislation when it went through the House in 2012. Why, if it's so good now, to slap it into the NATE legislation without giving it the courtesy of a select committee examination, why then did the Right Honourable Winston Peters vote against it? Silence. Silence from Mark Patterson. But I have another question, and this time for the Minister. The Honourable Damien O'Connor, who said in his speech just before the dinner break, and I quote him, "This is not about increasing powers for NATE officers." That's what he said. Go and check his Hansard. This is not about increasing powers for NATE officers. Well, I refer the minister to the explanatory note. It is about aligning the powers of the NATE Act for warrantless inspections and searches with those in the Search and Surveillance Act of 2012. Minister, it is about giving additional powers. It is about giving additional powers. He says it's equivalent powers to the Search and Surveillance legislation 2012. Is that what the minister's saying? It's equivalent powers. Well, then why did the Honourable Damien O'Connor vote against the Search and Surveillance legislation in 2012? Every Labor member in this House in 2012 voted against the Search and Surveillance legislation, and now they rush it in urgency into the NATE legislation on the pretence it's necessary for microplasma control. And the minister laughs. But the Greens they hang their head in shame because they're supporting this legislation and they're supporting urgency, and they voted against the Search and Surveillance legislation in 2012. How the wheel turns so suddenly. I remember the Honourable Steve Mahari when I was on this side of the House and he was on that of the House, and we were quizzing him on a similar issue, and he said, quote, "Oh, they're the sorts of things you say when you're in opposition." That's the famous, the Honourable Steve Mahari. Madam Speaker, this legislation could still go to a select committee. I want to know about these increased powers of search and surveillance, because it's been explained to me by the officials. It now means a NATE officer who may be well-trained, who may be well-educated, who may not be well-trained and may not be well-educated, may be a retired or broken-down farmer, can come onto my farm and, with the powers of this legislation, can grab all my financial records, can take any records that they want, and I can do nothing about it. That's what it seems to me, and the officials were unable to deny it. They did make the excuse, oh, the officer can't go into my house, my dwelling. Well, Damien O'Connor knows how the farming industry works. When you get a visitor, the first thing you do is say, come in, we'll sit round the kitchen table in my house. In other words, inadvertently, the farmers invited the officer into the house, and that gives that officer the chance to seize any information he or she wants. Is that right, Mr O'Connor? Silence. I'm not even sure that the Honourable Damien O'Connor understands what he's doing with this legislation. It is very draconian. And in fact, as one of my colleagues said, who was very involved in the search and surveillance legislation of 2012, this actually gives more power to a NATE officer than it does to the New Zealand Police Force. Well, Damien O'Connor scoffs and said that's not right. If it went to a select committee, Mr O'Connor, I could have sorted that out. I could have had that question asked. There is no need for urgency. I accept we need amendments to NATE legislation. I was the minister that brought it in. I accept the point that Mark Patterson made that we haven't seen good compliance and we need to tidy that up. But the minister's had 10 months to think about that. And what he does now is he introduces it dead of night, under urgency, and doesn't give the opposition the chance to ask the questions that we should be asking. And I say to the rural community, beware. There might be good intention around this legislation. There is a challenge to control Mycoplasma bovis in this country. There is a challenge to be the first country in the world that eradicates Mycoplasma bovis. But with this legislation, we are giving such extraordinary powers to unnamed officials that I think when farmers learn the extent of those powers, they will be worried. Many of them will be petrified. And it could have been sorted out. All we had to do was to send it to a select committee, and when when we said that to the Honourable Damien O'Connor, he refused, said it's going to be passed in the dead of night tonight. I think that's wrong.
Order. Apologise to the member. Your time has expired.
Madam Speaker.
I call the Honourable Eugenie Sage.
Tēnā koe, Madam Speaker. Thank you.